So today I want to talk about specifically how to defeat an atheist, how to rebut an atheist's argument that there is no God from a scientific perspective as well as from a logical and rational perspective. To prove something, first of all, you have to ask, whose burden is it? Whose burden? The burden of proof is on the person who makes the claim. That's true in law. The government claims that a person robbed a bank. It is the government's burden to prove that. If an atheist claims to you there is no God, it is that person's obligation or burden to prove it to you. Just as if you claim that there is a God, or that Christianity is correct, or Islam is correct, it is your burden then to prove that. But if somebody comes to you, it's their burden. Second, what's the standard of proof? Now, this is more a question in law. So in the US, in civil litigation, a standard might be preponderance of the evidence. For a criminal case, it might be something like evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that right now, maybe later in the lecture. But the question is, what is enough to prove the case? The third is, what evidence is available? When an atheist claims to you that there is no God, it is that person's burden. And then the next question would be, well, what is your evidence? Now, I'm going to put in parentheses premises. So premises are the statements that are going to be placed into a logical argument to arrive at a conclusion. So what is the evidence? The next question is, well, what's the argument? And more importantly, is the argument valid? I won't spend a lot of time on what a valid argument is. That is a question for logicians. But the argument has to be valid in order for the conclusion to work. So ways that an argument might not be valid are if there are hidden assumptions. The person gives you, evidence A and B to arrive at D, but you really need an assumption of C, which is unstated and maybe turns out to be false. So when you can identify false hidden assumptions, then you destroy the person's argument and their conclusion. And that's key. In everything I've learned about physics, one of the funnest things for me to do is to read a paper and discover and find the little hidden assumptions that aren't stated, but that could really affect the conclusion. So is the argument valid? And then also, besides missing or hidden assumptions, there might also be internal inconsistencies or contradictions. You have evidence A is the sky is blue, and then several more statements, and then later you get the sky is not blue. I mean, it would never be that ridiculous, but you can't have both of those at the same time because those are inconsistent. They're contradictory. So if you have contradictions in the argument, then the argument will not be valid. And I find them all the time. And then finally, once you've talked about the evidence, and whether the evidence is good enough, if it satisfies the standard of proof, and you've looked at the argument, and if that's valid, then you come to the conclusion. Is that conclusion sound? And sound means that conclusion indeed logically follows via the argument from the evidence or those premises. Okay? Here's why that matters. When an atheist comes to you, let's say they learn just through word of mouth that you believe in God. And then that person then asserts that you're wrong. They could either assert it directly by just going up to you and saying, yeah, I heard, that you believe in God, you're wrong. Don't be so silly as to believe that. Or it could be indirect. They make comments to other people about you that may affect your reputation or your credibility. Maybe it's a professor that's up for tenure, but the tenure committee discovered that he believes in God. I don't know if that happens or not, but you get my point. When this happens, what do? Well, first thing, point out it's their burden of proof. Ask them, what is the scientific evidence that you have, the premises, to support that conclusion? And then finally, what's the argument? And then take your time to analyze the argument. So we're going to do that right now with a couple of examples. There are some arguments that atheists give as to why there is no God. And I'm going to give you two of them right now that are really terrible. And I'm just going to write them in red. So the first is, people cannot walk on water. That is a premise. And then that the conclusion, which we'll say this is an implication sign, conclusion, there is no God. I hear this or some variation of it all the time. People picking out aspects of course, this comes from, I think, the Gospels of the New Testament, right? In Christianity, that Jesus walked on water. And so a person may see that when they're young, grow up and learn that no, people can't walk on water. Therefore, there is no God. I hope you see why that's such a ridiculous example. It's absolutely not a valid argument. It's not a sound conclusion because first of all, there are just so many missing or hidden assumptions. I mean, first of all, this is only referring to Jesus, to the Christian God, right? So how can you make a conclusion about no God or no creator as a whole, right? So that's one problem with it. There's a lot of other problems with it. You have to make a structured argument. Now, for example, what if, so let's call this premise 1. So I'm going to insert right into here a premise 2. Let's say it says, if the Christian Bible contains any false statements, then there is no God. Something like that. If we put in P2 right here, well, now it is indeed a valid argument. Valid in the sense that this and this together indeed imply that there's no God. Because if people can't walk on water, and that statement that somebody can walk on water, although I suppose Jesus isn't a person, Jesus is God. So that's an additional aspect where somebody might complain. Anyway, the point is that if you add P1 and P2 as assumptions, as premises, then maybe you could argue that this is a valid argument. But is P2, is it a correct statement that is based on evidence that satisfies any standard of proof? Well, of course not. I mean, the Christian Bible was written by humans, right? And so you could imagine a couple of errors in it, and that doesn't necessarily falsify the Christian God, let alone every other God. So the point is, this is just an invalid argument, but I hear it all the time. Another one that I hear is something very similar. It's something like, there is evil or injustice or sadness or badness in the world, therefore there is no God. Well, once again, there are so many hidden assumptions, unstated assumptions going into here that if you actually write them out, there isn't good reason to believe them, or at least they have to be argued. You have to have good evidence for them. God may have good reason to have evil in the world that we just don't understand. I think that probably is a response that Christians often make. I'm not going to argue it one way or the other. My point is, these are arguments, and there's all kinds of these crappy arguments that are made all the time by very smart people who aren't thinking through the logical steps and don't want to argue with you, because if you do try to argue and try to make them come up with those additional assumptions, then they shut down and they call you stupid or intellectually lazy. So what I want to talk about is what I think is probably the primary argument waged by physicists and scientists who study at the fundamental level. The primary argument against the existence of God. And it goes something like this. Science already explains everything. Therefore, there is no need of a God. Therefore, there is no God. I actually can't think of another reasonable argument. I think this is a reasonable argument. It's wrong, but I can't think of another argument that is seriously made by physicists who are atheists that differs substantially from this. Ultimately, it comes down to, we've already got it explained. There's no need for a God. Therefore, there is no God. There are a lot of problems with this. I'm going to start here first. Let's say that this actually was a valid or a sound conclusion, that there's no need of a God, whatever that means, and therefore there is no God. Well, that right there, I hope you see, that already is an invalid logical jump. Whether or not God exists has nothing to do with whether or not we as scientists think that we have a need for that God. But let's get to this one. Science already explains everything. It is often believed by many very smart people that science has already explained everything fundamentally from the Big Bang. Now, where did the Big Bang come from? There's no answer for that, but that everything is already explained by science. First of all, that's just crap. Absolutely it is not. There is so much we don't know about the universe. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say the existence of the first self-perpetuating molecule, life. There are people who claim now if you just throw enough amino acids and chemicals and so forth into a bucket and you zap it with lightning, that eventually you'll get a self-replicating chemical. We don't know. There's no actual evidence that that has happened or can happen or what the likelihood of that is. Anyway, my point is there's so many things that we don't know already. So the first thing I would then ask is, well, if science knows everything, then explain the Goldilocks enigma, the fine-tuning of the universe, which is very closely related to the question of information in the universe. There's a vast amount of information in the universe. Every atom and particle seems to be entangled via quantum entanglement with essentially every other particle in the universe. And the information of how each of those things is related is a vast quantity of information. Now, there are some that argue that information is constant. It isn't changing. It's the idea that information is conserved, much like energy is conserved. Maybe, maybe not. But we still have to come up with the answer of where did that information come from, which is very much related to this fine-tuning question of those fundamental constants. And if in fact the information is increasing because quantum interactions cause wave functions to collapse, we don't know if they do. I think they do. Roger Penrose thinks they do. A lot of people think they do. But if quantum events actually cause collapse of wave functions, then that means new information is generated in the universe. The information quantity is changing. Where does that information come from? The responses that I get from atheists who are physicists or computer scientists come down to two things. They come down to, first of all, it's a fascinating argument. The first argument is something like the sum of everything is nothing. Now, this is truly fascinating. What's the total charge in the universe? Charge is created by electrons and protons, right? So you can have charge on a battery when electrons accumulate on one side of that battery. But what is the total net charge of the universe? Well, if there are the same number of positively charged particles as there are negatively charged particles, then it adds up to zero, right? There's a net zero charge. Well, there's something even more interesting. And that's true for a lot of features of the universe. There's something even more interesting. I find it very interesting anyway. So this is a fascinating argument. The argument is that not only is the sum of all charge zero, and other features of the universe add up to zero, but the mass of everything in the universe, the energy in the entire universe, has a net of zero. So, of course, energy and mass are kind of the same thing. This is, of course, Einstein. So let's say that I have a massive object. We'll call it Earth. And then we have a less massive object, the moon. If we want to take the moon and pull it far away from the Earth, that takes energy, right? It creates gravitational potential energy. And if we could stop the moon from rotating and let it fall into the Earth, energy would be released in the form of a massive collision. Now, how much energy does it take to move the moon out to infinity? And when I say infinity, there is no such thing as infinity in the physical world. So what I really mean is really far away. So far away that the calculation doesn't change much if I keep pushing it away a little bit further. So if I want to move the moon out really far away from Earth, it takes a certain amount of energy, right? Well, that energy actually corresponds to a certain amount of mass. Clear? So here's something absolutely fascinating. The entire universe is massive. The visible universe is, 20-some billion light years across. I think it's even more than that. It's massive. And there are galaxies that are 14 billion light years away, right? In either direction. What is their gravitational potential energy relative to each other? What is our gravitational potential energy, our meaning the Earth, or individually, what is our gravitational potential energy relative to them? Well, the thing is, the universe is so vast and things are so massive and spread apart that if you do a calculation as to how much energy was required to take all of that mass and push it away at a speed that will allow it to continue expanding forever, which is what scientists believe will happen. Cosmologists think that it will continue to expand. The amount of energy that's necessary to cause all of that matter, all of those particles, to keep traveling away from each other despite their gravitational attraction, add up all that energy and put it in here. Then divide it by c squared and get an m, get a mass for that. Guess what that mass is? It's pretty darn close to the likely mass of everything in the universe. Isn't that amazing? The calculation isn't quite right. It's not quite perfect because there's still some things like dark matter that may exist, may or may not exist. But the point is, within an order of magnitude, within a factor of 10, all of the energy that's required to rip apart all that mass and keep it expanding forever, despite its gravitational potential energy, is approximately the energy in that mass according to E equals mc squared. Isn't that amazing? I love that. That's fascinating. So the argument then, now, by the way, we don't know if it's true. Like I said, the calculation is within an order of magnitude, but there are still a lot of things that are unaccounted for. We don't know the entire mass of the universe. We don't know, you get the idea. But to be that close is a pretty amazing thought. So the argument then is, if it's true that the mass of everything in the universe is exactly the gravitational potential energy of everything in the universe, then it all summed to zero, which means zero energy could have created it, because potential energy is negative, gravitational potential energy. So zero energy could have created it. So the argument goes like this. Well, the sum of everything, specifically energy, matter, is zero. And therefore, there's no need of a God, because what would God do with nothing? Everything in the universe is nothing. So there's no need for a God, therefore there's no God. I hope you immediately, intuitively see the problem with that argument. Just let it sink in. Everything adds up to zero, therefore everything came from zero, therefore it doesn't take anything to create what we have. To say that everything that exists came from nothing, and therefore nothing was needed to cause this to happen, is very different from saying maybe it's true that all the energy in the universe adds up to zero on net, but something was needed to pull the negative from the positive and create something. Just as you might have $100 in the bank and at the same time have a $100 debt, doesn't mean that money doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that nothing was involved in creating that liability and that asset, right? They add up to zero, sure, but that $100 in the bank is very real and that liability is very real. The second argument that is given, this idea of a multiverse. There are essentially infinitely many possible universes, and it's not just that they're possible, they actually exist. And because every possible universe is real, actually exists somewhere, then in the vast majority of them, there aren't stars and planets. In the vast majority of them, there aren't creatures, living creatures. In the vast majority of them, there aren't sentient creatures asking about the laws of physics. And we just happen to find ourselves in the one of very few, I presume, that would allow for us to have evolved from the earliest life to where we are now, to sentient creatures. It's this idea of it's sort of anthropic reasoning. It's the thought that, well, we do exist, and therefore there must have been the right conditions for that. And the question is, was it a God that created those conditions, or are there infinitely many universes with every possible set of conditions, and we just happen to find ourselves in one of those that allow for us to exist? So that is the argument. The argument is that there are essentially infinitely many universes. We can also say multi-information. So there's basically, it's the same idea, is that there is infinite information, whatever kind of information can exist, does exist somewhere. But they're all basically the same argument. And it's just this idea that we don't need a God because it turns out that everything that possibly can exist does exist, and here we are. What's the need for God? Well, this argument is problematic for at least 3 big reasons. The first one is that there's this idea in Christianity of, I believe, because I once owned a former Catholic church, I believe there's this idea of the alpha to the omega, which is the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet, representing God. The idea being that God is everything that possibly can exist. So I just think it's sort of ironic that their argument against the existence of God is what many people would regard as the very embodiment of God. Everything. A to Z. Alpha to omega. I just think it's funny. The second problem with this is, and I'll talk about this more in other seminars, this is a real problem. This symbol represents infinity. Infinity is a great concept in mathematics. For example, taking an integral from 0 to infinity can be done. You can calculate what it is. And the problem is that it fools a lot of people, because remember, physicists tend to be very good mathematicians too. Scientists have to take several levels of calculus and differential equations and so forth. They have to be good at math. So they use this symbol all the time. And most of the time, it's fine. It's a good way to do calculations. I'm not going to do one for you. But trust me when I say that the concept of infinity is super valuable in mathematics. It can be valuable when we look at the real world, like when we do calculations about the real world. There are times, often, where we have to do integration to infinity. And it makes sense in those cases. The problem is we get so used to, we as physicists, we as scientists, get so used to using this symbol that we start to think it's real. It's not. Infinity is not real. Infinity is not real. Infinity is not real. It doesn't exist. It's an idea. The universe is not infinite. There's nothing in the universe that is infinite. Infinity does not exist. But it's even worse than that. If you think of infinity as, for those of you who know calculus, if you think of it in terms of a limit, as something approaches infinity, and that's ultimately where integrals come from. They use the limit. Then that's fine. Then infinity simply means as you get bigger and bigger and bigger until the calculation doesn't really change anymore. That's fine. But there is no number. Infinity is not a number. Infinity is not a number. There is no such thing as infinity plus 1. You can watch some great YouTube videos, I may even link to them, on some demonstrations of some really interesting logic of a hotel that has infinitely many hotel rooms. And they're all booked. There's no vacancy. But you go to the front desk and you say, can I get a room? And they say, absolutely. Wait, what? How can you? There's no vacancy. Every room is full. That's right. But here's what we'll do. The first person, we will tell them to move to the second room. The person in the second room will tell them to move to the third room. And so forth down the line so that that new person can check into that first room, right? So already you see a contradiction. There's vacancy because they got the person in, and no vacancy at the same time. That is a contradiction. Infinity is a contradiction. There's no such thing as infinity plus 1 or infinity times 3. It's not a number. So this gets physicists into trouble all the time because what they're trying to do with the multiverse is this. I think everyone agrees that the likelihood, if you were to take, let's talk about the fine-tuning argument. So let's say there are 26 fundamental constants in the standard model of physics, and each one of them is a very specific number. We call it finely tuned. And if you were just to throw darts at a variety of numbers for each one of those constants, it's very unlikely you would come up with anything that would produce our universe. I think everyone agrees when they consider this, that the likelihood of this universe happening randomly is very, very, very low. So that probability is much, much less than 1, is very, 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 very close to 0. The counter-argument from the atheists is, we don't have to worry about a probability that is next to 0. We don't have to worry about that. Because all we do is we take a probability that is really, really, really close to 0, and we roll the dice infinitely many times. So we multiply something that's almost 0 by something that's almost infinity. So infinity could be like 1 over 0. 1 over 0 The reason that's undefined is because there's no way to divide 1 or divide 0 into 1. You just keep adding and adding and adding, and you would never get to 1. So the idea is you multiply infinity in the form of 1 over 0 to something that's essentially 0, and now you get 100%. Now it's really likely that you would get the universe such as ours. But again, infinity does not exist in the real world. But the strongest argument against the multiverse concept of all, in infinite information. You're a scientist. I'm a scientist. I'm a physicist. I believe in things that are testable, hypotheses that we can falsify. I'm interested in data. I'm interested also as a logician in logical arguments. The problem with the multiverse, I hope you're seeing, is that the visible universe is by definition what we can see because of light that was emitted and is traveling to us at the speed of light. We can't see beyond the visible universe. So if there's another universe, by definition, there is no way to know that it exists. There's no way to test whether a multiverse actually exists. Whether 2 universes or 3 universes or infinitely many universes exist, there's no way to test that. That is not science. I'm not the first person to point this out. This is widely known and understood. The problem is, people are still taking this seriously. And anyone, in my opinion, who is seriously talking from a science pedestal about a multiverse is not a scientist. They're not doing science. This is not testable. It's not observable. So I've basically addressed the only real argument that militant atheists give me that there is no God. And that's the idea that science already knows, can explain all of this. There's no need for a God, therefore there's no God. Already we know that that reasoning is inadequate, but the evidence, the science can already explain everything, is absolutely, absolutely not true. Even to the most fundamental question of how do you explain the organization of information in the universe? How do you explain the fine-tuning of those parameters in the standard model of physics? How do you explain any of those? And the response is invariably something like this. And that is just an inadequate argument. So finally, what I want to talk about. So before I mentioned when you are analyzing an argument, whose burden of proof is it? What is the evidence that's given? What is the structure of the argument? Is it valid? Are there hidden assumptions? Are there contradictions? And then finally, is the conclusion itself sound based on all that? But there is that other piece, which is the standard of proof. A scientist wants to know something about the world, asks a question, then starts digging into it, trying to collect data where that's possible, trying to do simulations where that's possible, trying to figure out the answer to that question. A scientist does not go into a situation already firmly believing something for which there is inadequate scientific data. That's not science, right? Or it's poor science. Because what ends up happening is, if you already believe something, you cherry pick the evidence that you want. It happens all the time. You cherry pick that conclusion or that data that you want to support a conclusion that you already believe, and that is not science. So here is one of my strongest criticisms of atheism. I'm fine if people are atheists. I don't try to convert them. If we have a conversation, great. But one of my biggest criticisms of atheism is that it is in fact a religion. It is a belief about something beyond that is unfounded in data. Now, they can certainly claim that my belief in God is unfounded in data. That's fine. But if they come to me and say that there's no God, it's their burden of proof. In my opinion, that atheism is really a religion is this. God has shown me his, her existence through my interactions in the world, through my studies of physics and science. That is how God has said, hello, I'm here, let's have a relationship. Ask an atheist, what would it take for you to have that same belief? And I've had this conversation many times. Ask them, well, what if one day you're walking along and the clouds parted and you saw a big face and then a hand pointed to you and said, hey, I'm God. Would that be adequate evidence? Now, there's some atheists who would say, yeah, I think that would be some evidence. Believe it or not, the majority of them that I talk to say, no, it's far more likely that somebody put LSD in my drink and that I'm hallucinating. So the problem is, if you see where this is going, the problem is they come to the table with a firm belief that is unfounded in empirical evidence, and change the standard of proof as evidence comes in. You can't do that. You can't be looking, you can't be cherry picking the evidence that you want to support a conclusion that you already, a conviction you already have, and call that science. So next time we'll talk more about logical arguments and finding incorrect conclusions in physics, but also we're going to talk about cases where logic caused amazing breakthroughs. As it turns out, you can derive logically most of special relativity, most of Einstein's special relativity, from two statements. And we'll talk about that later. But it is truly phenomenal what you can figure out just from premises and proper logical structure.